Hey, Shiloh Community Church. It's good to see you all. I am coming to you from down South Georgia. I didn't expect to be on the road this week, but here I am. So I'm going to be back for church on Sunday, but I wanted to do this for the Bible study. I'm actually going to be trying to do this every week we meet, so every other week when we meet for Bible study, just so people online have it too. So this is going to be our introduction to the Old Testament, so I'm excited. We're going to do kind of an intro today, and then we'll get started on Genesis. We're going to break Genesis into two parts. And so today, though, just kind of an overview of the Old Testament and what it is and what it can kind of mean to us. And I am going to begin. I'm going to begin with this video. Let me see if I can get it to play here.
If you open a Protestant Christian Bible and look at the table of contents, you'll notice the first 3 quarters is a collection called the Old Testament. If you look at the list of books, you'll see it's made up of 39 smaller works that are grouped into 4 main sections. The first 5 are called the Pentateuch, followed by the historical books, then the poetic books, and finally the books of the prophets. Now that seems simple enough, but actually it's more complicated and way more interesting. This arrangement of the books in a single volume called the Old Testament is a later Christian tradition that developed after Jesus and the apostles. In ancient Jewish tradition, these works were all on separate scrolls and were conceived of as a unified 3-part collection called Tanakh. It's a Hebrew acronym for Torah, which means instruction, Nevi'im, which means prophets, and Ketuvim, which means writings. The Tanakh has the same books as the Protestant Old Testament, but they're arranged differently. The Torah corresponds to the Pentateuch, but the prophets consist of 4 historical narrative books and then the 15 works named after specific prophets. After this comes the writings, a diverse collection of poetic and narrative texts. Now this 3-part design is really, really old. It's referred to in ancient Jewish texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Wisdom of Ben Sira, even Jesus of Nazareth mentioned it. And that's because this 3-part shape is woven into the compositional design of the scrolls themselves. If you pay attention, you'll discover that every scroll has been coordinated by means of cross-references that link each work into the larger 3-part collection. So, who put all these scrolls together? It was a long process. Some of the famous contributors are named, like Moses or David, but most of the authors remain anonymous. In the Bible, they're simply called scribes or the prophets. These scrolls took shape throughout Israel's history as generations of prophetic scribes collected earlier stories and poems, integrated them into larger compositions, and then eventually shaped all this material into the unified library of scrolls, the Tanakh. It's clear from texts in the Psalms and prophets that these prophetic scribes believed that God's Spirit was guiding this whole process, so that through these human words, God speaks to his people. That's why they treasured these texts, studying and composing them into a unified collection. We don't know when precisely this process was finished, but it was somewhere in the last centuries before the time of Jesus. In its final shape, the Tanakh offers a prophetic interpretation of Israel's history that claims to reveal God's purposes to rescue the whole world. And while we can't do justice to the whole collection in one video, it's helpful to get an overview of what these scrolls are all about. The Torah begins with God creating and blessing a great piece of real estate, our very good world. And God entrusts it to a creature that reflects the divine image, human, or in Hebrew, Adam. God appoints humanity to rule the world as kings and queens of creation. And the question is whether they will trust God's wisdom to discern good and evil, or seize autonomy and define good and evil for themselves. But there's another creature with the humans, a mysterious snake. It's in rebellion against the Creator, and it dupes the humans to foolishly rebel against God's generosity. As a result, humanity is separated from its divine source of life and exiled from a garden of blessing to die in a dangerous wilderness. From there, humanity keeps spreading and redefining good and evil, and things go downhill fast. They build cities plagued by violence and oppression, all leading to the foundation of a city called Babylon, where people exalt themselves to the place of God. And now the basic plot conflict of the whole Bible is set. God wants to bless his world and rule it through humans. But now, humans are the problem. They're under the influence of evil, they're stupid and short-sighted, and headed for self-destruction. And this is all a setup for God's solution, We need a new kind of human. And so God promises that a new human will come who won't give in to the snake. In fact, he'll crush it and be crushed by it. From here, the story traces the promised lineage to a man and a woman, Abraham and Sarah. God entrusts them with the same divine blessing given to humanity on page 1. And so they leave Babylon to a new garden-like land that God promises to give his family. What follows is the story of Abraham's family. 3 generations, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, followed by 12 sons. And our hopes are high until we read their very dysfunctional and destructive family story. They lie, cheat, nearly kill each other, not to mention the sex scandals. But what did you expect after the garden story? They're humans. Eventually, Abraham's family ends up exiled down in Egypt. All these failures of Abraham's family form a dark background for the handful of bright moments in the story. God stays committed to these people. He even makes them an eternal promise called a covenant, that he will rescue and bless all humanity through them. How exactly isn't clear, but Abraham's family is at its best when they stop their selfish scheming and trust God's promise with radical faith. From here, the family grows. They end up enslaved in Egypt, and we're introduced to the Torah's other main character, Moses. God raises him up to rescue the Israelites and bring them to a mountain where they're all invited into a covenant relationship with God. They're given 613 terms of the relationship, guidelines for becoming new kinds of humans who will faithfully represent God to the world. And Moses brokers this whole deal because he's awesome. He's the ultimate prophet who speaks God's word to Israel. He's a priest who represents them before God. And he's even called a king, Israel's leader and deliverer in time of need. But as the Torah progresses, the Israelites fail big time. They violate the covenant, and even Moses rebels against God. In fact, the Torah ends with Moses predicting that Israel's failure will continue as they go back into the promised land, and they're going to end up in exile once again. But he has hope that God will fulfill his promise to rescue Israel. One day he will cover for their failures. He'll heal their selfish hearts so they can truly love God and live. And then Moses dies. Now, the final sentences of the Torah scroll are surprising. They zoom forward in time, and we hear from the prophetic scribes who shaped the Tanakh. They reflect back on the story of Moses from their vantage point, and they tell us that never again in Israel's history did a prophet like Moses arise. Man, I wish another prophet, priest, king like him would come along. And with that, we move into the Nevi'im. It has 2 sub-collections. First, the former prophets, 4 narrative works about Israel's story in the Promised Land, told from the later perspective of the prophets. Things start great with Joshua's leadership. We're told he's successful because he's just like Moses, and he meditates on Scripture day and night. But eventually, even Joshua fails, beginning Israel's long and violent descent into self-destruction, just like Moses and the garden story anticipated. These stories mostly focus on the failure of Israel's kings, prophets, and priests, how they lie, cheat, and kill each other, and worship idols. It's basically a longer, bloodier replay of the ancestors' failures. But there are some bright spots. God reaffirms his covenant promise to bless humanity through a new human. It will be a king from the line of David. And you get some stories about people like David or Solomon who have moments like Abraham when they trust God, but it never lasts. And wouldn't you know it, the family of Abraham ends up right where they began, conquered and exiled in Babylon. But remember, this whole story is being told from the later perspective of the prophets, and they know exile isn't the end. So they designed these stories of Israel's past as pointers to their future hope. When God does rescue his people out of Babylon, he'll send that new king who will be like Moses and David and Solomon were on their good days. In fact, this is what the second part of the Nevi'im, the latter prophets, is all about. There are 3 large and 12 short works connected to specific prophets. And this design intentionally recalls the 3 plus 12 ancestors from Genesis, whose stories of failure contained the seeds of future hope. These prophetic scrolls are loaded with cross-references that link back into the narrative of the Torah and the prophets, and they carry the story further. The job of Israel's prophets was to be like Moses, to accuse the old Israel of failure and corruption, and to warn them about the looming result, the great day of the Lord, which ended with defeat and exile in Babylon. But the prophets also promised that God had a purpose, to purify his people and recreate a new Israel who would be faithful like Abraham was. They'll live in a new covenant relationship with God under the reign of that promised ruler, who's described as a new Moses, but called by the name David. He will be the one to restore God's blessing to the entire world. The conclusion of the Nevi'im is just like the Torah. There's a note from the Tanakh's prophetic scribes. They reflect back over the whole story so far, and they urge readers to anticipate the arrival of a new Moses-like prophet, who they call Elijah. He will announce the arrival of Israel's God to purify and save his people. From here, we move into the Tanakh's third and final sub-collection, the Ketuvim, a diverse collection of scrolls. Each one has been designed to link back into the key themes from the Torah and the prophets and develop them further through an elaborate tapestry of cross-references. For example, the Psalms scroll is introduced by two poems that are coordinated to the beginning of the Torah and the prophets. In the first psalm, we meet the righteous one, who's described as a new Joshua, a successful leader who meditates on the scriptures. He's like the king promised by Moses, and he's like the eternal tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Psalm 2 then identifies this figure. It's the promised king, the Son of God from the line of David, who's going to defeat evil among the nations and restore God's blessing to the world. And the rest of the Psalm scroll teaches God's people how to pray as they wait for this future hope. Then there are the wisdom scrolls that address some of the most difficult questions raised by the story of the Torah and the prophets. So Proverbs sounds like Moses in the Torah. Trust in God, be faithful and obedient, and you'll have peace and success. But then Ecclesiastes and Job reflect back on Israel's complicated history and say, yeah, we tried that, and it's not that simple. These three books carry on a profound conversation about what it means to live wisely in God's good and often confusing world. Two of the last books of the Tanakh to be written make a crucial contribution. The Daniel scroll looks back over the long history of Israel's failure and suffering as a strange door of hope into a new future for the world. One day, that new human promised in the Torah and prophets will arrive. He's going to be trampled by humanity's animal-like inclinations towards evil, but then God will vindicate him and raise him up to rule the world in divine power. And finally, the Scroll of Chronicles retells the entire story of the Tanakh, from the beginning up to Israel's return from exile. The author focuses on God's promise to David of a future king who will reunite God's people in a new Jerusalem and bring divine blessing to the nations. The final lines of the Chronicles scroll have been coordinated with key texts from all over the Tanakh. They keep alive the hope of an ultimate return from exile, pointing to the arrival of an Israelite whose God is with him, that he may go up and restore the new Jerusalem, and that's how the story ends. The Tanakh is a majestically and intentionally designed collection of ancient Hebrew scrolls. These diverse texts from all periods of Israel's history have been woven together as a unified story about God's covenant promise to Israel and to all humanity. They were made for a lifetime's worth of reading and reflection, as these remarkable human words offer a divine word of wisdom and future hope that still speaks today.
I've found these videos very helpful. They give kind of a very good overview of some things, but I'm going to break this down even more a little bit for us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Old Testament stuff. I'm going to give you all some kind of prompts to talk amongst yourselves too. And basically, so the Old Testament is a collection of books. Now, when we use the word book, it's important to understand we're referring to the Bible as a book, but it's a book made up of smaller books, right? The Old Testament is 39 books, to be precise, of various different authors. And so when we talk about a book of the Bible, of course, we're meaning not just the Bible itself, but these smaller books within it. So though the Old Testament is about God, the Old Testament really doesn't explain or defend God's existence. It just assumes that God exists. When the Old Testament was written, gods were everywhere, right? The Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Hebrews, they were all theistic people. They all had their own gods. The difference between Israel and all of its neighbors were not that the Jews had a god and the others didn't. It was more the difference that Israel had one God while their neighbors had many gods. The Old Testament books were carefully presented on how unique Israel's God is. when we read the Old Testament, the fourth word we come to is God. Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God. We know this. We assume this. But if we don't get beyond that fourth word, we really have trouble reading the rest of the Bible. So it's easy for us to just assume to say that in the beginning, God, and it was a singular God. People way back when would have had a difficult time even just getting past this, but we look to the Old Testament to see who God really is. How we think about God is crucial, and the Old Testament helps us understand who God is, what God's like, including God's love, God's grace, God's character, so much more. Writer after writer puts forth effort of who and what God is, not only to us, but for us. So, most people know about the Old Testament. There's some people and events that you're familiar with. You've heard of Adam and Eve, you've heard of Abraham and David and Goliath, the plagues in Egypt, Moses and the Red Sea, the Ten Commandments, right? We can go, this hotel that I'm staying in tonight has a Gideon Bible. You can open it up and we can read about Samson and the Ark and Solomon's wisdom. People who've never been to a church before know the 23rd Psalm, right? But who the characters actually were, where they fit into the Old Testament story, not just snippets of stories, not just cherry-picking verses here and there, but the entire breadth of the Bible. Who was Samson? How did he relate historically to David and Moses? When did he live? What did he do? What did the Ten Commandments refer to? Why were they written? Who got the Ten Commandments? What do they mean? All of these events are important individually by themselves, but when they are seen in their proper historical setting, when we have a better understanding of how and why they're contributed, we get the larger picture, a healthier, more mature understanding of what the Bible is and about who God is. So ultimately, because fewer people really truly know the Old Testament, it's important for us to understand the Old Testament books and how they're written, why they're written, how they're organized, how they're cataloged. And this last video that we just watched gave us a little bit of that. It gave us a kind of a rundown intro, but to really understand the Old Testament as it's seen in our Bible, so in the Christian Bible of Old Testament and New Testament, I wanted to break it down for us. The Old Testament books, like it started to say a little bit there, are not arranged chronologically, so they're not in order of time. So if you read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you're going to be from the beginning. It doesn't follow time in the beginning, but instead they're grouped into three different types of literature. We talked about that, those styles of writing. The first 17 books, Genesis all the way to Esther, tell the story from beginning to end. After Esther, there are 5 books of wisdom and poetry: Job, Psalm, Proverb, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. They're Israel's poetry and wisdom writings. And then the third collection of books is the 17 Old Testament prophecy books. You have the major prophets and the minor prophets within there. So we have the narrative books that tell the story. We have the Old Testament poetry and wisdom books. And then we have the last section of the Old Testament that contained the prophetic books. But how I would like to kind of divide this up even further is to help us out so that we don't read this like a history book or a novel. We'll get to explore these books in more detail in the weeks to come, but I wanted to kind of break this all down for us so that we understand where these books line up and where they go. So first is the Old Testament's story. Only when we can see kind of where the Old Testament poets and prophets fit can then we make sense of them. So the Old Testament story is told in the first 17 of the 39 Old Testament books. That's important for us to know to start. But we're going to make a further distinction here by dividing the 17 story or narrative books into 2 different categories. And this is helpful for me, at least. I hope it's helpful for you. So moving forward, even though all 17 books contribute to the story, only 11 of the 17, I think, actually move the story forward. The other 6 books are important events. They add details to the main plot. So if you've listened to a storyteller who constantly digresses and lets the story get bogged down with too much detail, you can appreciate the difference between books that keep the story moving and what we call filler or fluff. It's not important. They are important. They add detail, but they don't necessarily contribute to the story's progress. So for the purposes of our lesson, we'll call the books that move forward the story time. These are time books. They add things to it. The ones that add commentary to the story we call color books. These are the ones that add detail and depth. For instance, Exodus is a time book. It moves the story forward. It tells us about the events of Sinai when Moses received God's law. These 613 laws that we just heard about are essential to Israel's life. They needed to be recorded for them and for us, but Exodus is a narrative. It's a story. Moses didn't list and describe all of those laws in Exodus. He put them in a separate book called Leviticus. Now, Leviticus adds the essential details of what Moses received at Mount Sinai. So that's one of the color books. It adds depth to the events that are recorded in Exodus, but not necessarily moving along the timeline. Does that make sense? So, 17 books that tell the Old Testament story. We call them the storybooks or narrative books. And then we would divide those narrative books even more to books that tell the Old Testament story into two categories of time books and color books. Time books being the ones that move the story forward. Color books are the ones that give details to the story. The 11 time books, if we splice them together, kind of like a movie reel, one book typically picks up where the next book stops. But periodically, the story needs elaboration and explanation. It's like a grand storyteller telling a story says, oh, but wait, we need to talk about this just a little bit more. And that's where our color books, our detail books come in. So the Old Testament can be divided into four kind of time periods or eras. This is helpful for us as well. We call the first time period the period of kind of beginnings. It's the first three books, Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, the first three time books, right? The second era is in Joshua and Judges, and this is the settlement era. The third era is the kingdom era. It's recorded in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And at the end of 2nd Kings, Israel's conquered by the Babylonians. Jerusalem's walls and temple are destroyed. Her people are taken into Babylon as slaves. And 17 years later, they're released by the Persians and allowed to return to rebuild their temple, to rebuild their city and all of their lives. And so the fourth period of the Old Testament is called the exile and reconstruction era. This is in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's a very broad bird's eye view of the Old Testament story. The beginning, the settlement, the kingdom, the exile, and the reconstruction. So we got the kind of big picture there of what that looks like as far as the timelines go. And we get into the different color books that we can add to it. We have Leviticus that adds some of the laws and everything. Deuteronomy, also a color book. Job, a color book that is one of my absolute favorites, wrestling with the question of why good people suffer. It fits kind of in the Abrahamic timeline. It fits in with Abraham's story, but gives a little bit more elaboration on it. Leviticus, I already mentioned that. That's where we get the 613 laws. Deuteronomy is another one that doesn't really move the story forward, but gives us more insight into a particular period of Israel's history that's between the book of Numbers, which is Israel's wandering around in the wilderness, and the book of Joshua, which tells us about Israel's conquest finally of Canaan. In Deuteronomy, Moses actually reissues the law that God gave at Sinai. So the people that were going into Canaan were not the same people who came out of Egypt. You remember that. There were a 40-year gap. Generations had passed. And so Moses made sure that this generation knew the laws that happened in Leviticus. So Deuteronomy fits into the narrative between Numbers and Joshua there. The next book that occurs almost a century after Deuteronomy, color book, is Lamentations. Lamentations fits into the end of the king era. So after 2nd Kings, Jerusalem's destroyed, and Jeremiah's lament over his people's disobedience and the consequences are recorded there in this book. Esther's story, fantastic story that's recorded in Ezra and adds an important dimension to Israel's reconstruction era. So this is 70 years after the Babylonians conquered Judah and the Persians released the Jews from exile. Many of them returned to Jerusalem, and Ezra's book tells us what life was like in the Jerusalem when the Jews rebuilt the temple. Esther tells us the story of the people who came to stay in Persia. Her story tells us what life was like for the Jews who didn't return and teaches us that God cares for his people wherever they may be. First and Second Chronicles also fit historically with Ezra and Nehemiah at the end of the Old Testament era, and they focus on the kings in David's dynasty and in Solomon's temple. The book's purpose is really to show us that Judah's situation 600 years after David and Solomon died, what happened with them, and 70 years after the enslavement by the Babylonians, to see what Judah's people are like back in their land, even though they're still being ruled by the Persians. Chronicles was written really to assure that Judah's people knew that in spite of appearances, God had not abandoned them. And that's why Second Chronicles really reminds us that God's blessing isn't just an automatic thing. We don't just get it, but that it is there for us when God says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear them from heaven and forgive their sin and heal their land. Those are the color books. So we have the time books that move the story along, the color books that contribute to that and fall within those specific time periods. Then we have the poetry and wisdom books. These are great. These are the ones we know and love, like the Psalms that we say a psalm almost every single Sunday. Job is another wisdom book. Proverbs, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes. We'll cover those as well. Those all fit a specific type of teaching. They're teaching literature. The prophetic books, and then they come in, there's 16 writings of the prophets. They span Israel's history from the division of the kingdom recorded in 1 Kings all the way through the end of the Old Testament recorded in Nehemiah. There are many prophets who ministered in Israel, but their prophecies were not collected into books. But these ones were Elijah, Elisha, for instance, are two of Israel's most famous prophets, but they're not prophetic books named for them, but they show up, and we'll talk about them. 12 of the prophets that ministered during the divided kingdom recorded in 1 Kings through the 2 Kings. One of those 12, Ezekiel, continued his ministry into the exile period. Daniel's prophetic ministry occurred during the exile. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi all prophesied during the Reconstruction period. And we'll study the prophets in detail when we get to them. I know that's a lot. It's a lot to talk about. So that's the Old Testament, the 11 books that chronologically tell the story. We plug in those color books to give us the detailed and expanded view of what was going on during those historical periods. And then we get to the Israel's wisdom and poetry that's written to preserve that kind of history and rich culture and teachings. And then the prophetic books that begin to minister when Israel's kingdom is split and the nation is trying to rebuild itself. That's the Old Testament. Really a book about God's relationship with us. When we get to that overarching story, we're going to see it's really all about God's redemption. And it goes right into the New Testament, into the gospel, and to Jesus. Well, question time. Some time for discussion. So I'm going to sneeze in just a second. Oh, no? I did. Okay, question time. What were you hoping to get out of a Old Testament overview? What are some things you are hoping to discuss? So talk amongst yourselves. What are some things you're hoping to discuss? What are some things that you're hoping to get out of this study? If you're at home watching this online, feel free to journal, do some time of self-reflection, whatever works good for you over these questions. Otherwise, I want you all in the church to talk about these things. So what are you looking forward to talking? What are some things that you hope to discuss during this Old Testament study? And then what are some things maybe today that you hadn't heard before? What did you learn today? What was something that stood out from you today? And even just our brief flyby overview of the Old Testament, or in our awesome introduction video. I love those videos. We're going to be watching one of those for each of our books as we go along. They're very helpful. So what's something you hope to learn? What's something you did learn today? I look forward to joining you back for this. Hopefully I'll be in person next time, but like I said, I'm going to be making these videos regardless because it's great to have online for our people that can't make it in person. Once again, Jared here, Pastor Jared, Shiloh Community Church. It's so good to get to do these Bible studies. I'm excited for Genesis coming up in 2 weeks. All right, what were you looking forward to learning, and what's something that stuck out for you? What did you learn? I'll see you next time.